I usually don't remember files after I've closed them. That's how the system works. A record is forwarded, confirmations accumulate, and eventually there's nothing left to verify. Planet 5 didn't follow that rule. I opened this file more times than necessary, not because new information emerged, but because there was nothing. Grimm realized that before I did. He said that some records feel heavier the longer they're left open, then laughed as if that explained something. Mara didn't lift her head. She repeated the checklist, convinced that the sequence itself was the problem. Planet 5 involved a single deployment. One team, one approved route, one target. No overlapping operations, no secondary efforts, no parallel missions running in the background. The landing process was recorded. Movement began immediately afterward. Environmental indicators remained stable. Communication was clear and uninterrupted in the initial phase. Everything that should be in a normal log is here, exactly where it should be. If I were reading this for the first time, I would expect the file to end a few lines later. But it didn't. The movement stopped without warning. Not slowly, not after interference, but a complete interruption. No distress signal, no emergency flag, no notes explaining the delay. After that point, absolutely no confirmation whatsoever. The people listed in the record never returned to the system, and the equipment assigned to them was never rechecked. The record could not have continued without that final step. Grimm kept asking what could have interrupted a task so completely. Mara kept searching for a step that had been skipped. I still left the record open because, according to procedure, it was never completed.
I begin with the environmental section, not because it usually contains the answer, but because it determines whether anything following should be noted. Planet 5 is described as predominantly sandy, with large rocky outcrops rising from the surface at irregular intervals. No vegetation is listed, no fluid systems are present, and no stable structures are noted on the surface. The terrain is uneven but gently sloping, more akin to layered sand dunes than loose sediments. Gravity is within acceptable limits, close enough to baseline so that prolonged movement will not cause stress. The atmosphere supports standard filtration without time constraints. Light levels are stable throughout the rotation period, with no abrupt changes noted. I stop here and reread the passage. Nothing in these conditions requires extreme caution. Standing, walking, carrying equipment, nothing was restricted by the environment as noted. I moved on to a detailed description of how the data was collected and validated. Initial metrics were collected remotely, then verified live after landing. Measurements were taken sequentially and repeated as needed. Position tracking remained active from the start of movement on the surface. Signal quality was assessed as stable in the initial phase, with no data compression issues or latency noted. The team moved in formation, maintaining distance within acceptable limits. Each checkpoint was recorded as expected. The data showed no gaps or anomalies in the collection process. Where data was collected more than once, the results matched closely. There were no notes indicating uncertainty or the need for reinterpretation. Everything recorded matched what the equipment was designed to collect, and the validation process appears to have been performed correctly. The survey history ended cleanly and abruptly. The last transmission arrived at a normal time, confirming continued movement along the approved route. After that, nothing more. The signal did not attenuate, fluctuate, or trigger automatic alerts. It simply stopped. No distress calls were attached. No emergency protocols were activated. No changes were recorded in the movement pattern prior to the signal loss. Following standard procedure, the carrier deployed reconnaissance drones along the last confirmed route. The drones accurately followed the path, scanning the surrounding area. They found no people, no bodies. What they recorded were items scattered on the sand, personal equipment, and tools assigned to the team. These items appeared at a few points along the route, fairly far apart. There were no traces, no disturbances on the surrounding terrain, and no signs of a struggle. I reached the final section and noted what was missing. Personnel listed as deployed were never recorded as having returned. The delivered equipment was not fully recovered. No cause of loss was recorded, which prevents escalation according to existing criteria. At the same time, the lack of confirmation of return prevented the record from being closed. Everything that could be remotely verified was verified. The environment was satisfactory, the data collection process was reasonable, the survey history contained no procedural errors, only a missing closing section. I marked the record accordingly. The final remaining step is in-person verification. To resolve the record, we will have to follow the same route, approach the locations identified by the drone, and determine what prevented this record from reaching the final line.
The aircraft carrier hadn't been in orbit long enough to be sensed. The moment the landing window opened, the decision was behind us. A single drop module was prepared, locked, and released as planned. 6 names were listed for the surface deployment: Grim, Mara, myself, and 3 escorts tasked with maneuvering and controlling the surrounding area. The modules separated neatly, gravity immediately taking over. There was no visibility beyond brief alignment checks, no sense of movement beyond the vibrations as we passed through the upper levels. Grim gripped his seatbelt tighter than necessary and muttered something about how much he liked machines that could still return. Mara didn't respond. She monitored the indicators until they stabilized, then checked again, as if repetition might reveal something not seen the first time. The crash was controlled and within acceptable limits. The module sank gently into the sand before stabilizing, the force evenly distributed across the bottom. The internal systems were functioning normally. The external indicators matched what the file predicted. When the hatch opened, the surface appeared without resistance. Sand stretched out in all directions, interrupted only by scattered rocks rising like islands. We disembarked one by one, the guide first, then Mara, followed by Grim, and finally me. The sand compacted underfoot without sinking. It held its shape, layered and dense enough to walk on without adjustment. Breathing through the filter was easy. The air had no weight or strange odor. Nothing here contradicted the notes we had read. We lined up and began moving along the approved route. The formation held steady naturally, the distance maintained without adjustment. The terrain shifted subtly. Sand dunes rising and falling, rocky outcrops interrupting the surface at irregular intervals. Grim kept glancing down at the sand, then up at the horizon, as if checking to see if the ground was keeping pace with us. Mara signaled for a slight adjustment in speed to maintain line as we circled a cluster of rocks. She didn't stop. She rarely stopped. I compared what I saw to the records as we moved. The distances seemed correct. The angles matched. The surface worked exactly as described. The first location marked by the drone in the records appeared without warning. Nothing marked it except the coordinates themselves. A few rocks stood nearby, casting short, constantly shifting shadows on the sand. This area looked no different from the ground we had already traversed. Grim slowed down slightly, then tried to catch up with the group's pace, as if accustomed to this routine. Mara signaled for a slight adjustment in speed to maintain line as we circled a cluster of rocks. She didn't stop. She rarely stopped. I compared what I saw to the records as we moved. The distances seemed correct. The angles matched. The surface worked exactly as described. The first location marked by the drone in the records appeared without warning. Nothing marked it except the coordinates themselves. A few rocks stood nearby, casting short, constantly shifting shadows on the sand. This area looked no different from the ground we had already traversed. Grim slowed down slightly, then tried to catch up with the group's pace, as if accustomed to this routine. Mara checked the coordinates against her screen and briefly signaled to stop. I acknowledged our presence and noted no deviations. No sounds echoed except the wind. No movement was detected other than ours. If this were a routine verification, we would have prepared to move on. Everything here matched the file. The surface remained still, unaffected by our presence, as we prepared to continue along the same route that had ended without explanation.
We continued along the approved route without changing formation. The sand stretched steadily ahead, interrupted only by scattered rocks that forced us to change direction slightly, but never enough to disrupt the movement. Each step slightly compressed the surface before it returned to its original position, leaving no noticeable marks. The distance remained within the permissible limits, maintained primarily by habit rather than guidance. The guides remained in their positions, one in front, one beside, one behind. I focused on the markers ahead, checking the distance and alignment with the formation as we moved. The operating environment was exactly as described. The air remained stable. The surface had no resistance. Nothing here required stopping or adjusting beyond maintaining normal speed. As we crossed a wider stretch of sand, Mara slowed and paused briefly to check a series of indicators. The pause was brief, more like a hesitation than a stop, and the formation continued moving around her without breaking the rhythm. While she checked the data, Grimm reacted in an almost unnoticed way. He shifted his weight once, then again, as if examining the ground beneath his feet. His voice was low, soft enough to sound like he was talking to himself. He said that the sand here felt strange, as if it carried a faint vibration he couldn't identify. Those words weren't directed at anyone in particular. They didn't interrupt the movement. Mara finished her check and continued walking, and Grimm immediately fell silent, as if that thought no longer mattered. The line closed naturally, and whatever had prompted that remark faded into the background of the movement and the wind. A few steps later, everything continued as before. The wind blew across the sand erratically. We moved steadily, without rushing. Grimm edged closer to the center of the formation than before. He muttered something vague about how places like this always disrupted his sense of time, then fell silent again. Mara adjusted his pace and direction forward, maintaining distance with small, effective movements without interrupting the progress. The indicators stabilized again. Nothing repeated. In the context of this file, there was no reason to consider that moment significant. The formation widened again as we passed another open, sandy area. This time, the distance didn't self-adjust. The change was gradual, subtle enough that it took a few seconds to notice. I slowed down and turned back. The assigned escort at the rear was no longer there. There was no sound, no movement, no disturbance in the sand where he should have been standing. For a brief moment, I assumed he had paused to adjust his equipment or his stance. That assumption was incorrect. We returned along the old path, observing the surface as we went. The sand was fine and uninterrupted. There were no tracks leading elsewhere, no depressions indicating subsidence. The only thing remaining was an indefinite void. Grimm was silent, his face pale. Mara bent down for a moment to check the position, then straightened up. I recorded the loss as it was, sudden, silent, and complete. The path remained unchanged. The surface showed no reaction. The only confirmation was its absence.
We don't turn back after the first loss. No one suggests it, and no one asks. Whatever took him did so without warning, and standing around the empty space feels more dangerous than leaving it behind. The formation tightens instinctively as we move on, spacing reduced just enough that everyone remains within peripheral view. The pace increases slightly, not a run, not even a hurry, just enough to keep momentum from slipping away. The sand still holds firm beneath our boots. Rock formations pass at regular intervals. On the surface, nothing appears to have changed. Grimm stays closer than before, his earlier restlessness replaced by a focused silence. Mara keeps the route intact, correcting direction with short, efficient gestures that don't require anyone to look back. I track positions by motion rather than by count, letting the rhythm of movement replace certainty. The wind begins to change as we cross a broader stretch of open sand. At first, it's nothing more than pressure, a steady push that leans against the line without forcing it apart. Fine grains lift low from the surface, skimming across our boots and lower legs. Visibility softens, edges blurring just enough to make distance harder to judge. We keep moving. Heads lower slightly, shoulders angle into the wind. The outlines ahead fade and sharpen again as gusts rise and fall. No one calls a halt, not yet. Stopping still feels like a choice, and no one wants to be the one who makes it. The sand thickens gradually, then all at once. What had been a nuisance becomes resistance. Fine grains rise higher, filling the air in dense sheets that scrape against our visors and filters. Keeping eyes open takes effort. Forward motion turns uncertain, each step threatening to break the formation entirely. Shapes flatten, depth collapses. Walking blind like this becomes riskier than standing still. Mara's fist comes up sharply, the signal immediate and unmistakable. The line slows, then stops, not because anyone believes it's safe, but because moving any farther would scatter us.
We brace where we are, feet planted, bodies angled into the wind, letting the storm press against us while we wait for visibility to return enough to move again. As the storm began to subside, not quite over but merely diminishing, the sand continued to move in irregular patches, gradually revealing shapes that were neither entirely clear nor entirely distinct. In that moment of stillness, I counted the people and hesitated. A figure at the edge of the shape seemed out of place, either too far away or indistinct. I assumed it was the storm distorting the distance, flattening the contrast, turning movement into an illusion. I said nothing. The wind rose again, then subsided, and the outline never became clear. When the storm finally subsided and visibility returned completely, the absence became undeniable. No one stood where there should have been an escort. No equipment on the sand, no backpack, no tools, nothing left to mark the location. The surface was smooth and uninterrupted, as if no one had ever been there. For a moment, no one reacted. Then Grim moved first, stepping forward abruptly, as if the Count had finally caught up with him. One of the remaining escorts broke formation at the same time, both advancing toward the empty space without waiting for instructions. Grim knelt on one knee and pressed his hands to the sand, digging quickly and carelessly, tossing the earth aside as if the surface were lying. The escort came with him, using both hands to pull the sand, widening the shallow holes, convinced that the missing person must be buried just below the surface. The sand was scattered, loose and dry, with no sign of collapse. There was nothing to find. No cloth, no equipment, no indentation to show that anyone had been there. Grim only stopped digging when his hands touched the same layer of earth again and again. He looked up once, his face bewildered and frightened, then down again at the hole that should not have been empty. Mara pulls them back before the hole gets any deeper, signaling forward without explanation, and after one last look at the sand that gives us nothing back, we reform the line and move on.
We didn't move far after the storm, not because someone ordered us to stop, but because the natural pace slowed as visibility returned. The ranks loosened, formation becoming more suggestive than a rule. One of the escorts stopped a few steps ahead, lifted one foot, and shook it vigorously. Sand gushed from his boot in a continuous stream. He cursed softly, more annoyed than frightened, then bent down to brush away the remaining sand. No one urged him. We had all felt it, how the sand seeped in, crushing each step. We drifted closer, dispersing without thinking. Grim again mentioned the dead earlier. While we were talking, I listened and looked down at the ground as it happened. There was no warning sound, only a slight tremor far enough away to be recognized as dangerous. In that instant, the sand just below the escort's position shifted with a rustling sound, like a surface collapsing under sudden weight. Something enormous shattered in a single movement, pale, sinewy, clearly alive. The escort didn't have time to scream. The ground cracked open and pulled him down as if he weighed nothing at all. It was all over almost immediately. One moment he was there, hunched over and cursing his boot. The next he was gone, dragged straight down in front of us. The thing that took him didn't linger. It didn't turn. The moment it seized him, it vanished into the sand and dissolved, leaving the ground collapsing like water closing after it dives. For a moment, no one moved. Not because we were calm, but because our minds were trying to catch up with what our eyes had just seen. Then it all happened at once. Grim screamed. He grabbed his gun and fired at the spot, the bullets tearing pointlessly through the sand where nothing remained. Grim mumbled something incomprehensible. Mara grabbed Grim and pulled him back, shouting for everyone to get out of the way. There was no discussion, no analysis. What we saw was too simple to override everything else. Something lay beneath the sand, and it was man-eating. Standing still no longer felt like a mistake. It felt like an invitation. We ran. Order vanished completely as survival took precedence. No one looked back to see if the sand had shifted again. No one waited to see if it would surface a second time. In that moment, we didn't think about the timing, the conditions, or why it had chosen that particular moment. We just thought that it had surfaced once and it could surface again. The rocks in the distance became the only clear direction, their dark shapes standing out against the pale sand. We ran toward them immediately afterward.
We reached the rocks without looking back. The sand suddenly gave way to rocks, the sound of our shoes scraping against the rough surfaces forcing us to slow down whether we wanted to or not. We climbed higher than necessary, clinging to the sharp edges of the rocks that cut our gloves, pulling ourselves up ledges just high enough to stand on without slipping. The ground here was much firmer than the sand. It didn't shift. It didn't react to our weight. When we finally stopped, it wasn't because we felt safe, but because nothing followed us up. Below, the desert looked unchanged, flat, bland, silent. No ripples, no movement. The absence of pursuit felt temporary, like a granted silence that needed no explanation. As we moved along the cliff face, we began to notice equipment stuck in shallow cracks and crevices, containers, tools, broken modules marked with serial numbers that weren't ours. These weren't random pieces of debris, it was a deliberate arrangement. Someone had climbed up here before us and left their belongings behind because they couldn't carry them any further. We found the remains not long after. The bones, discolored from exposure to the weather, brittle and incomplete, lay nestled in a rocky crevice where the shade flickered only briefly each cycle. There was no burial, no shelter, only what remained when the final movement ceased. The truth came quietly. This place wasn't an escape, it was the end. Then we stopped reacting and began to think. No one left to protect, nowhere to run, nothing left to do. We compared the deaths in order, not emotionally, but mechanically. Where they stood, how long they stopped, what the surface looked like each time. Grimm suggested trying something small. We tested the sand at the edge of the rocks, first the tools, then the backpack, then one of us stepped down for a moment and then moved again. Nothing happened. When we held our weight in place without moving, even for just a few seconds, the sand would rise and shift underneath. We didn't wait long enough to see more. We didn't need to. The rule was clear. A person with enough mass standing still on an empty sand dune, just a few seconds and it would happen. The following days faded away. We didn't go far because moving meant crossing the sand, and crossing the sand meant choosing between speed and exhaustion. We accounted for every scrap: water, electricity, time. The numbers were worse than we'd predicted and no better to say. Water was running low. Food was dwindling. We began to moderate our conversation just as we moderated our food. Every hour on the rock felt like a rehearsal for what had happened to the skeletons beneath us. We talked about time, signals, and what might happen if someone slipped, but the truth lay deep beneath it all. Unless something changed, we would all end up here, gentler, quieter, left where the movement had stopped. When that thought finally settled, it no longer felt dramatic, it felt inevitable. And that's when an image appeared in the distance, a figure.
And then a figure appeared in the distance. A silhouette, moving steadily across the sand as if there were no reason to hurry. At first, none of us said anything. Hunger and exhaustion often create convincing illusions. Then the figure drew closer, becoming a silhouette we all recognized long before we could see the details. The posture, the rhythm, the way he moved without hesitation. Our head of department, Keen, the man none of us expected to meet before death. He didn't wave, he didn't call. He leaped onto the rocks with ease as if gravity were there, stopping before us and looking each of us in the face as if confirming a report whose outcome he already knew. He listened as we spoke in unison, recounting the deaths, the sand, what lay beneath it. He didn't interrupt. When we finished, he nodded once and told us we were wrong about one thing. The creature didn't hunt. It didn't chase movement. Rather, it reacted to stillness, weight without movement. He performed without any formality, stepping down onto the sandy surface, then pacing back and forth in a closed circle, never stopping long enough to wait for a reaction. The sand remained still. When he paused slightly longer than necessary, the sand tightened beneath his feet, and the moment the ground collapsed, he leaped to one side, and in that same instant, a creature resembling a giant worm emerged from the sand. He swung his arm, and a punch landed squarely on the worm's body as it rose high enough, heavy and bare before us. There was no explosion, only a dry, deep sound of impact, like metal striking thick flesh. The worm's body convulsed violently, its enormous muscles contracting reflexively. Sand flew up like crashing waves. He didn't stop. A second punch followed immediately, landing in a different spot, then a third, a fourth, each one delivering the full weight of his body into a brief moment. Each time his hand touched its body, the ground shook beneath our feet. The worm thrashed violently, its massive body swaying from side to side, trying to drag him down with it. He dodged close to its body, continuing his attack from an impossibly close range where there was no room to retreat, no time to think. Another punch landed, so powerful that the entire front of its body caved in, mucus gushing from its mouth. The sound was no longer a collision, but something being shattered from within. The worm roared, a deep rumble that sent chunks of sand sliding around it. He reached behind his back and pulled out 2 axes. The axe blade flashed for a split second before striking down. The first blow plunged deep into the worm's body, held back by a layer of flesh so thick it seemed impenetrable. He yanked, pulling the axe out with a violent jolt from the creature beneath. The second blow came immediately, deeper, more vicious. The sand was stained dark. The worm thrashed about, its massive body slamming against the ground in panic, its muscles losing their rhythm, no longer reacting precisely. He continued to advance, not allowing it to retreat, not allowing it to stand still long enough to regain its reflexes. The axe came down repeatedly, each blow like a chop at something that shouldn't exist on this surface. The worm tried to dive, but each time it pulled its body down, he forced it back up with his own movements. Another punch, this time straight at the spot that had just been struck, caused its entire body to convulse in pain. Finally, the creature collapsed, the ground closing in behind it with late, heavy tremors, as if the surface itself were trying to forget what had just happened. He stood there just long enough to catch his breath. Then he turned and spoke to us. "Let's go," he said, his voice eerily normal.